Hello there, welcome to Nothing Worth Saying. Formerly we were ARC Podcast, but we thought it was about time for a rebrand and we thought we'd focus on a name that reflected who we were and what we're trying to achieve. It's often said that if you've got nothing worth saying, say nothing. Well, we're going to say it anyway. We're 5 friends from university from a range of backgrounds with a range of views. So we've got Ben and Tom, who are cousins from Stoke. We've got Joe, who's from Newcastle, Ellis from Basingstoke, and me, Tom, from Reading. So each podcast, we're going to aim to discuss a different current affairs topic, culture, or history. And it's something that we think is worth discussing. And even if we've got nothing worth saying, we're going to give it a go. We aren't experts, but we hope that some of these discussions might be informed and we can discuss some complicated topics and hopefully bring you something worth listening to. To break up the sound of each of us droning on each episode, we'll be breaking up our regular podcasts with interviews from interesting people with different views and perspectives. We're all very new to this, and we'll be changing up the format regularly until we find something that fits and feels right, and most importantly, something that you can enjoy. Please give us any feedback, comments, criticism, all really important to make sure that we're not just talking to ourselves here, and there's something worth listening to. So we're hoping to just have a chat, stay informed, and make something at least a little bit entertaining. Now on with today's episode, and I hope you enjoy. So today we're going to be talking about national service. We've changed up the format for this episode, so we're going to have it in a more debate style. So Ben and I will be arguing for national service, and Tom and Joe will be arguing against national service. But first of all, we'll do our favourite thing, the fun facts. So, Joe, why don't you kick us off with your fun fact for the week?
I've got a fun fact about Garfield, the cat, everyone's favourite ginger lasagna-loving cat. And it's named after Jim Davis's grandfather, James A. Garfield Davis. I think that's quite wholesome.
That is quite wholesome. Tom, should we move on to you?
Well, today, as we speak, it is St. George's Day, the day of celebration of the greatest patron saint. And I personally think we should make more of a deal out of it. I know everyone makes a big effort out of St. Patrick's Day, but St. George clearly vastly outweighs St. Patrick. So I think that's worth mentioning. And I think another couple of fun facts about St. George. He never actually stepped foot on English soil, and he was born in modern-day Turkey. But I think we can forgive him for that.
Oh, that is fun. And Ben, can we please have your fun fact for this week?
Well, Tom, I thought you would never ask. I've gone down a bit of a black hole recently with Turning Point USA and learning a bit more about what they stand for. And Candace Owens gave me a fun fact recently, not personally, but over YouTube. Did you know that the single motherhood rate within black families in the USA in the modern day stands at 75%? This contrasts with 25% in the early 1950s. And she puts it down to mass incarceration of black men in the USA, an erosion of support for the family unit, both within society as a whole and through government policies that actually incentivize single motherhood and then remove that father figure from the home and then increases the likelihood of criminal activity, mental health issues later on in life.
Oh, wow.
It'd be interesting to see how that compares to how the single motherhood rate is increased across the population as a whole. See if it's increased at a greater rate. Obviously, a threefold increase, I imagine it probably has, but it would be interesting to see how that's gone in other demographics.
That'd be interesting. So my fun fact for the week is that a dessert stomach is a real thing. Your gut expands upon contact with sugar and therefore makes extra room for dessert, even after you feel full. So, yeah, when you always said, yeah, I have room for dessert, apparently you did.
You do.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get on with the podcast. We're going to make 3 points for, 3 points against, and then we're going to discuss them each in turn. So the first 3 points are for, made by Ben and myself, are going to be social cohesion, the benefits of social cohesion in the national service, the benefits to health, both of mind and body, and finally security and recruitment for various services. So Ben, kick us off with the first point.
So yeah, on social cohesion, I think we've got today a large amount, and I think it affects young men. So teenagers going through puberty, they're at that point where they've got a lot of energy, they don't really know where to put it in the best ways. And when you've got that both in young lads in deprived kind of post-industrial areas, like actually the kind of areas that me and Tom are from, there's a lot of anger and resentment at the circumstances in which young men find themselves. So they tend to go more towards kind of hard right ideology, things like Britain First, the BNP, the EDL. And then on the other side, you've got the failure with immigrant groups coming over into Britain to integrate fully into British culture and to kind of merge the two together. So then you get a similar case, but with young lads who are then more vulnerable to extremist ideology like ISIS and Islamic fundamentalism. And I think if you had a program where those two groups of young, resentful, angry men are forced to work together over a period of months for a shared common goal and for the country as well, I think both groups kind of get a shared understanding of each other and a shared set of values that then they can take forward. I think that's a massively important point on this. And I think national service, it cures many ills. So you've got mental health that Tom will be talking about, and then this kind of social cohesion, and you can reduce radicalisation to the fringes, on the fringes of British society through this as well. And I think it deals with a lot of other issues down the line. You don't have to spend as much money on counter-terror operations, counter-extremism operations, like Prevent, for example, when those problems don't arise in the first place. So, yeah, that's the argument I think for that.
Brilliant. And I think I'd also supplement that with it gives young people a better relationship with the state as well.
Definitely.
You see the state as less of an antagonist in certain groups. You know, you see the state as a positive, a giver.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the first point 4.
I think you do make a good point there, but I'd have to say that the thing is with national service, especially from a military point of view, you would not. It's not for everyone, is it? Like a lot of people say, you're going to get a lot of discipline from this regimented lifestyle, but unfortunately, that doesn't fit for everyone. And I think what you would, as much as you would get rid of some resentment from a lot of people because they've been given this regimented lifestyle, they're given a sense of purpose, maybe. I think also at the other end of the spectrum, if it's compulsory for everyone, you've got people who are quite career focused. They know what they want to do, and you're interrupting that for, say, a year for something that they don't want to do. You know, it might get in the way of a relationship, it might get in the way of a career. And you've got this kind of situation where it works for some people and it doesn't work for others. And you've got to kind of find a balance of, is it worth it?
Well, you can make that argument both ways. I mean, I know in one of the articles that was circulated between us to prepare for this, there was the article about the inclusion of women since 1995 in the Finnish Armed Forces, and it said there was a statistic in there that said something between 60 and 70% of all the women that went into the Finnish took part in leadership training. That then it was obviously applicable while they were in the armed forces, but also after in civilian life. So I mean, when you've got qualifications that you can take as broad as leadership training, but then also nursing and medical work, you've got engineering roles, like technical roles, HGV licenses, things like that. It gives people skills in a wide variety of areas. I mean, I've just named a few there, but I'm sure there are much more diverse skill sets that you can develop in the forces. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a purely military role. I mean, one thing that we were talking about was more in civil society, so the emergency services as well. So yeah, I think it could be quite broad, the training that people get, and it's not just marching, stripping and putting back together a machine gun.
Okay, I'm glad we covered that. I think we did that one to a good degree. Let's move on to health. So I think one of the biggest issues with young people and our society at the moment is that we as a society are becoming increasingly overweight, and a larger and larger proportion of our society is now obese and overweight. So I think it's 23% of the population is currently obese in the UK. And I think that is hugely detrimental, not only for people's lives, you know, people dying from this, from being overweight and obese, but also it's a huge cost to our NHS. It's estimated that obesity is the third largest cost to our NHS. And I think that if you can find a way to offset that by not only just the physical training and the regimen of national service, you know, getting everyone to be active, it's also instilling that mindset into people, that healthy mind, healthy body, get people to have a more healthy relationship with exercise. People maybe go on runs in the mornings. You know, the army lifestyle does instill in you a sense that being healthy is a positive thing and it can positively help your life. And it is important to notice that exercise has been linked to increased endorphin release, a better mental health state. It's one of the things that Jordan Peterson talks about all the time, is the fact that if you exercise, it can benefit your mental health. However much you agree or disagree with Jordan Peterson, it is true that exercising can benefit you mentally. Often if I exercise in the mornings, I do feel better that day. I have a more positive outlook on that day, and I think that that's an important relationship to develop at a younger age, 18 to 24-year-olds, still developing habits that will impact your later life and benefit you later on in life. So I think if you can get people doing that, and also doing it as a community, doing it collectively, if that's something everyone goes through, it's a shared collective good to have everyone a healthier society, and a society that's healthier together as well.
Yeah. Well, Tom, on that point when you're talking about Jordan Peterson, have you heard of Akira the Don?
I've not.
Well, Akira the Don is a guy who created something called Meaning Wave, and he samples pieces of things that Jordan Peterson says and Jocko Willink, the Navy SEAL, and Joe Rogan, and turns it into motivational music. And honestly, I've been listening to it today, and it's mental. It makes me want to climb a mountain. So the whole kind of motivational thing, and yeah, the positive impact of exercise like that is brilliant. I mean,
Exactly,
I've
yeah.
taken up jiu-jitsu, and this is something that Joe Rogan talks about a lot, like the positive impact of it, and it's brilliant. It's been very beneficial to me.
And imagine that on a larger scale, where you have individuals encouraging you more than a YouTube video, but it's an individual there encouraging you to exercise, to be healthy,
Yeah.
and also getting people's relationship with food. When you are given the exact number of calories you need in a day, you will be full from that number of calories. It's about getting people a healthy relationship with food as well.
Yeah.
I think there are two kind of main points for me on like a health perspective that counter that. I think the first is mental health. Now, these facts we're about to bring up are from the military, but I'm sure they'll apply to policing and other kind of stressful roles like that as well. And it's important to notice that within the UK Army, around 4% of veterans kind of have reported some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder. 19.7% reported some other kind of mental disorders. Roughly 13% have gone through some kind of alcohol misuse. And it's massively important to note that it can have a massive effect on mental health. But also, if you're going to force people and push people into the armed forces or policing, that's only going to increase. If you put more people who perhaps not everyone is fit for that into those types of stressful environments, you're just going to get more and more. So perhaps from a mental health environment, there are lots of benefits, but there's also risks to look at as well. And I think if you look at the studies in more in deep detail, it's not even all people who have necessarily been deployed. And secondly, in terms of injuries, it's not just people who are deployed or ever really see action that get injured. People get injured in training all the time. And again, when you put people who aren't fit and ready, who don't have the same motivation, who aren't cut out for it into those training environments, you're just going to break so many people, whether that's physically or mentally. So I think that's definitely something that I'm sure can be controlled if it's implemented in a sensible manner. But it's definitely a risk that needs to be looked at.
I think that's true. I think one way to come back to that is to say that is an issue wider with our military culture. So the fact that we don't offer counselling as standard to our veterans is an issue which I think you'd have to address on a broader scale to the military itself, is that we need to get better at making sure people are supported after they serve. And I think that one thing the military does do is give people a support structure. So people who are lonely, who don't have a group of friends in society, who do feel left behind, as Ben mentioned earlier, they would be given the support structure. And I think that would avoid people being left behind and avoid this loneliness. And I think that, the suicide rate goes up every year. And I think that if there was a system where people felt they were encouraged and supported, which the military has the potential to be, it's not necessarily fulfilling that function now, but if it was a whole society thing, not even just the military, the services, I think that could be really beneficial, giving people the support structure. But as Tom said, it would need huge reform, but I think that reform should happen whether or not you institute a national service anyway, to make sure that people aren't left behind after they leave the military.
Yeah. Well, the suicide rate among men is rising all the time. The biggest killer of men under 50 is suicide, the single biggest killer. But I would point out that the reason for that is a crisis of meaning in Western civilization more broadly. But if we're talking about this specific issue, I think it's a crisis of meaning that leads us down this path, and an erosion of kind of support for masculinity. It's seen purely in a toxic masculinity sense. And I think actually to include this sort of national service where you can give a young man a meaning and a purpose, then I think actually that would have a positive effect on mental health, not a negative one.
I completely agree that there are definitely pros on a mental health standpoint to be gained. I just think
And I think-
that there's also things that need to be controlled for.
There's risks.
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, true.
I
Yeah.
think it goes. I think you start. It's a bit of a backwards argument though, because okay, so men being in combat, or people. I'm not just men. Anyone who's in the armed forces. Yeah, there are mental health issues that arise because of that, because of the stressful situations that they're in. But you don't get rid of the military to solve that issue. You just deal with the mental health problem better. There's a raising awareness of mental health, as it should be, in recent years. And I think you just have to continue that work and expand that work if you built a system of national service, like we're saying. You don't just avoid the issue.
And like Ben's just alluded to there, with not just men, people, I think that as well, if this national service was expanded to all people 18 to 24, regardless of their gender, and it's not necessarily just a military thing, you could say that if you look at the burnout rate for people going into office environments, high stress office environments, having mental breakdowns, things like that, it's again increasing each year. And if they are already put into a very high stress environment, but they're incredibly well supported, like in a military setting, then I think that they'd be more able to cope with later stresses in their life. Okay, should we move on to the third point? So our third point is about security and recruitment. So the CAPTA who outsourced for the military recruitment have missed their targets for the last 6 years for recruitment. And that means that we're currently short of, I believe it was 7,000, or was it 3,000? Sorry.
We're going to be 3,000 short, yeah.
We're going to be 3,000 short, but then each year they miss it by several thousand. And we're going to be 3,000 short by the end of this contract. And it means that our military is incredibly understaffed. And the thing is, if you look at national service as not just a military thing, you look at it as policing, you look at it as nursing potentially, firefighters, paramedics, you look at it as a whole range of civil society that you inject people into in this public service roles. You look at our policing, our police are massively understaffed. You look at nursing, we're really struggling to recruit nurses. So if you look at there's 5.5 million 18 to 24-year-olds in the UK at the moment. If you put all of those people into these public service roles, not only are you giving them important life skills, as we mentioned earlier, you're also ensuring that we meet these targets and ensuring that these vital parts of our society are filled, these vital roles are filled. So, for example, our military, we currently do meet our 2% NATO targets, but imagine the ability we would have to react to any situation. So let's say we did go to war. If we're currently 3,000 people short, we would really struggle to react in a situation where we suddenly needed to fight another power or go into do conflict resolution, peacekeeping. We would really struggle to react to that in time and have to recruit a load of people very quickly, probably to a poorer level. But if you had a large national service, almost like reservists, they're not necessarily your frontline professional army troops, but they are a huge resource you can then quickly get up to the standard where you can deploy them. Because the national service training, when we used to have it, was 6 weeks. But that was back when our military training was very short because we'd just come out of the Second World War. So I think that now you'd have a much longer training period, and it would be a prolonged training period. You'd basically be being trained the whole year that you're serving, I think, is the way I would envision it. But getting necessary skills as well as the necessary military training to the point where you'd be able to deploy around the world a large military force for the UK very quickly. Also, as I mentioned, your policing, your nursing, you'd be able to meet these targets, and I think that civil society would benefit hugely from this.
I mean, yeah, but I think for things like national service for nursing, I think nursing isn't something you can just train for in 6 weeks, and you are ultimately dealing with people's medication, dealing with people's lives. You know, like nursing is a long course, it's a vocational course, it's hard, and I don't think it's something that you can fix by just chucking a load of 18 to 24-year-old kids who have only chosen to do it because that's the one that they kind of like the most out of the options. I think there's a very big risk of that actually being quite counterproductive, because then you're just flooding a hospital with a bunch of untrained or poorly trained people who are inexperienced. They don't necessarily want to be there, all of them. And they're just kind of getting in the way of the medical staff who have been trained and causing problems.
Sure. I think it would have to be a reform to the nursing system as well, though. I think it would have to be. To what extent do you let people do this? To what extent are they involved? Are they administering medication? Probably not. Or probably not at the start, at least. And I think, because I don't know how long the nursing course is. I think a nursing course is a year long, right?
No,
Is it
you
2
do
years?
nursing for 3 years.
3 years, sorry. So you're not going to have fully trained nurses, but people who would be able to do things in a capacity in a hospital like porters. I think there is an issue with how you train these people, but maybe if you elect for certain national service schemes such as nursing, you would have to commit to a longer scheme rather than a shorter military one. You could commit to a longer nursing one. I think that the other huge benefit of this national service scheme is that you are getting people from a massive talent pool. It's a great way to inject very talented people into the public sector. So people who would never normally consider nursing suddenly would consider nursing after getting this taste for it. People who would never normally consider policing, you get this group of people who would never consider going into the police, suddenly going to the police, realizing they're very good at this, and then pursuing that as a further career. So I think that that's one of the huge benefits of this, is that not only are you recruiting more people, you're recruiting the cream of the crop in a way into this who wouldn't normally consider this and who would only consider the private sector previously. Okay, so we've dealt with the pros now. So now let's hear the cons from Joe and Tom.
So our three main cons of national service are the cost to the government and society of implementing this policy, the failure of the NCS, which was a scheme brought in by David Cameron, which had similar goals in mind, and then also what support is there amongst young people in society to actually implement this policy, and will it be effective without the support? So Joe is now going to start with our first argument against.
Yeah, so my main argument, I guess, would be just the cost of the whole thing. A British soldier costs taxpayer £1,000 a month. Their full training is £36,000, and you're not even taking into consideration equipment, just deploying people, moving them around, all this sort of thing. So if you're suddenly injecting an entire age group into the military, that's a massive burden to the taxpayer that you've suddenly got to shoulder. And not only that, is it the most efficient use of money to fix the recruitment problems in the military? I don't necessarily think it is. If you're going to spend that much money, surely you want to have more highly trained professional soldiers who are going to stay there much longer because they want to be there. And how you go about doing that is another question entirely. But I feel like it's not the best use of money. Plus, there's also the whole thing of, well, okay, if you're going to keep costs down, how do you do that? Do you want to have them there on a volunteer basis? Well, that's going to make resentment absolutely massive. If you're forcing people to do this program of either military service or some other civic duty for a year, then well, they're going to want to be paid, aren't they? So if they're not paid, then do you do it for a much shorter length of time? And that's something that I think Macron has recently tried to kind of bring up, hasn't he? He's had to water down his national service program quite considerably because he just realized the funds aren't there. And so now it's gone all the way down to something like you do a month of this civic thing, and then you do a 3-month course in the military. But then you get to the point of, well, if they're only going to be in the military 3 months, what's the point? Because they're going to have to be trained, but then either they're going to be trained for something that they're not going to do because they're only there for 3 months, or they're going to have such low quality, such limited training because they'll only be able to do a few things, that what's the point in even having them there?
I think it goes back to a quite fundamental question about what is the state for. And the first duty of the state is the defence of its citizens. So I'm actually quite hawkish, I suppose, on military spending. I would consider myself a pacifist in terms of intervention. You shouldn't go out and interfere in the goings on in another sovereign nation. But on national defence itself and on the spending on defence, I think it's a no-brainer. I think that if there's one thing that the government should be able to justify spending money on, it is on the military. So there's that point to be made as to what's the state even for if it's not guaranteeing the security of the country itself. But then taking that to one side, when I talked about the myriad benefits of national service, one is that defence element and security against foreign powers, but then you've also got the social integration that it would bring. And like I say, it goes into so many other areas. Would you need such a de-radicalisation budget if you had national service? Would you need such a high health budget, NHS budget? So if you're talking about the tax, it has multiple benefits. You could put money, a small percentage of the budget from each department that it would affect. So say you could have one, you'd obviously have money going from the defence department, but also health, also crime and policing, because you would see in a more culturally homogenous society, you would probably see a lower level of crime as well, and crimes that are most motivated by race and racial differences and cultural differences. And as well, if you're talking about social services and things of benefit to the state, there's quite a lot of academic literature to suggest that the kind of cultural homogeneity and monoculturalism that this sort of policy would support, it actually increases support for GDP increases in things like the NHS, healthcare, more community-based projects. So you'd probably see a stronger welfare state as a result. I mean, think infrastructure projects as well. If you had a national service where you go into construction and engineering, think of the infrastructure projects that you could build to help the country in the long term.
I can definitely agree with that. I think, improving infrastructure on a national level would be a very good idea. But I think what you say about there'd be a bit more cohesion, especially with, you've got these fringe ideals. I've been listening to a podcast recently. The guys in it, they're American veterans. They've all been deployed and stuff. And they're very left wing. So obviously there's some bias I have here. But they've all got counter stories as well, about just how these, radical, a lot of them were right-wing radical ideals as well. Radical ideals aren't suppressed in the military at all. In fact, they're kind of almost not actively encouraged, but they don't get, they can gain traction. People kind of almost encourage them, not necessarily superiors, but squad mates or whatever. There's videos of people making swastikas out of C4, and there's at least 4 or 5 people videoing this. You've got recently the Paras shooting a picture of Jeremy Corbyn. Now, I'm not saying that that's far right behavior, but it suggests that while there is this kind of discipline, there's also a tolerance of ideals that could be quite dangerous. And if you then allow this back into society, then you've got ramifications for it.
So I think another big point is, if you look at a policy that was been introduced recently with very similar goals to the goals that we have outlined for national service, then and we look at how effective that has been. And David Cameron had his big social goal, and he had this similar aim in mind. And what he put together was the NCS. And I think there are definitely flaws in how it's been implemented. But if we just look at the numbers that have gone into it, if nothing else, I think so. It got implemented in 2011, and in 2017-18, there was 100,000 people who decided to take it up. Which, when we talked about the number of people in that age group, I think that's a really small percentage, and it just shows that it isn't necessarily that popular. I don't know, and I think it's partly to do with the fact that I think if you're going to implement this, it needs to really start on an education basis. People really need to understand the benefits, and I think that's going to take a long, long time. I think in order for this to become an effective policy, there needs to be a real societal change to where people want to be more socially aware. It's great saying that it'll bring people together, but people need to see the benefits of working for the state and working for one another. I think another thing, if you look at the NCS, it goes back onto Joe's point about cost. They only took in 100,000 people last year, but it costed over 180 million. And the NCS doesn't pay people wages in the same way that national service would. So again, this is just another example of how it would be incredibly expensive. And experts have been critical of the NCS at large in the past couple of years.
Yeah, one thing that I've read, Tom, that supports what you just said is I read an article critical of the NCS, making a lot of similar points to what you've made, and the writer pointed out that the Scouts already exists, and like the Brownies, whatever the female equivalent is. The sorts of things that we're talking about are already covered by the Scouts. So, and that's a completely voluntary organisation that has no money given to it from the state. So, I suppose it's a carrot and stick kind of argument. You could say, okay, well, the services like the NCS or the Scouts are there for those people that want to go into it and provide an incentive for those people, the kind of carrot. Or you implement a national service program where it's kind of a stick towards, right, this is what you should do. This as a society is what we're going to expect of you at a certain age, almost like a rite of passage before you become an adult. And it's more of a kind of stick policy to force support for that kind of service.
I just think when you see so few numbers of people who have volunteered to take it up, then the idea of forcing that on people will be so unpopular.
I think,
it can easily breed a toxic atmosphere.
Yeah, potentially. You'd have people dodging it, of course, and not everybody's going to take it up. But like I say, if you wanted,
you'll have the equivalent of Trump in 20 years' time saying, "I'm not stupid. I'm not going into national service."
Well, yeah, I mean that always happens with anything. Elites find a way to get out of stuff, and
I think elitism is a big point that needs to be raised. It's another thing that needs to be tackled. How do you stop the private school kids and the kids with the dad's an army general? How do you stop them either being able to dodge it or be able to get the cushy jobs or getting the best treatment? I think that's another thing. If you want to make it somewhere everyone does a rite of passage and everyone feels like they're in it together, you need to tackle elitism at the heart of it.
Yeah, I think the issue with NCS, as we talked about, is it is voluntary in a way. That is a problem with it, is that it's voluntary. And also, I mean, I didn't even know NCS existed until I got to uni and people talked about NCS. Like, it's not really well advertised in a way. The one thing I did do was I did CCF, so I did cadets, which is basically like a light version of national service, really. And I absolutely loved it. It was brilliant. I had a fantastic opportunity to do leadership. I led over 70 cadets. I did competitions. I learned to sail. I learned to read nautical maps. I learned to shoot different types of weapons.
Transferable skills.
Brilliant transferable skills. I talk about it in interviews, for job interviews, and people genuinely are like, oh wow, that's pretty impressive leadership stuff, because I planned lessons, I taught people. You learn to march, you learn to follow orders, which is very important for the later careers. Learning to work as part of a team. We did loads of team building exercises. That was almost what it was. It was about team building and teaching people how to work as a group. And I think that if you did that at a point where everyone has to do it, it's a shared cultural experience. It's something that could be a much better version of what the NCS tried to be, but didn't have the teeth to be. NCS isn't something you can half-heart. You can't do if you feel like it, maybe go for it. You need to do everyone has to do this, and you have to properly throw yourselves into it as a society. You need to, there will be resistance, but that would go away after a generation. Once it becomes a cultural aspect of everyone's lives, then that resistance to national service, I think, would go away. People would accept it, and it would be seen as more your civic duty, in the same way that jury service is, in the same way as voting is. Like, if you tried to implement taxes from a place where there's no taxes in society, no one would pay their taxes. Everyone would hate that idea. But as it stands, everyone pays their taxes because that's what you do.
Or most people pay their taxes.
Most people pay their taxes.
Yeah, we've got a big problem in this country with that.
But if 90% of people in the UK pay their taxes, probably over that. And if you did it, you had a society where everyone goes and does national service, after a generation, the resistance would go away because it would just be like paying taxes. It's something that you do.
Yeah.
But then, like taxes, people find a way to dodge it, don't they? Yeah. And it tends to be the richest who manage to.
Yeah. What's that song from the Labour 1997 election campaign? Because I'm getting strong overtones of that over the last few minutes. Things can only get better.
Yes, things can only get better, yeah.
Yeah, I'm getting a very I Have a Dream vibe for me and Tom.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Well, just a brief aside. What was it? Saddam Hussein ran with a version of "I Will Always Love You."
Did he really?
Yeah, he did. When
he's not gassing Iranians.
That'll teach him to not have weapons of mass
talking about
destruction.
strongmen leaders, there's a particular one who rose to power in Germany who had a similar kind of national citizen service mindset that he
And look
employed.
at how well transformed the German economy was from 1933 to 1938.
Oh,
You look
no.
at how the German economy absolutely transformed under that scheme.
Oh no.
Well, I think what we have instead of Hitler, the Hitler Youth, I think we should have the Jacob Rees-Mogg Youth. So it'd be the JRM Youth, and they all they have to spend most of their national service wearing a monocle or something like that.
And just exclusively speaking in Latin.
Yeah.
Anyway, should we move on to the final point?
Mm.
Well, we've already covered a lot of it, but let's move on to the final point.
Yeah, I just like to bring up again the fact that there's not really that much support for it. And so there's a YouGov poll that was basically everyone other than the people who would actually have to do it support it. So 18 to 24-year-olds opposed it, but with a margin of 62%, with a 28% remaining unsure.
That's because they're all fat and playing on their Xboxes.
I'm not fat.
Who
You're
listens to
playing
it?
on your Xbox.
Yeah, I bet you are probably playing on your Xbox right now.
Yeah,
And I
but
don't
to be fair, I think that's a good point. It's easy for like someone who just kind of has this attitude of, "Oh, millennials are all snowflakes and they don't know how good they've got it, so go and do that." Well, they've never had to do anything like that in their lives, and I think there's a lot of that of like things with this in my day, things with this in my day. The youth now are like this, and they didn't have to go and do this national service. So why is it fair? And that's not to say there wasn't this policy in the past, so you can't implement it now.
Yeah, all the baby boomers who would support this, they never had to do national service, because they were 18 in like 1970. So
Yeah, but
it was
also spent
gone
more
by
money
then.
at the time on. We also spent more money at that time on national defence. So I'm pretty
That's
sure the
true.
British defence budget in that time was at least double what it is now.
But I think
So,
at the
that
same
time,
time, you've got to look at the time. You've got a massive Cold War between two powers. Nuclear war is imminent all the time. And right now, it's just not the same. Yeah, okay, there's a massive threat of terrorism, but you don't need to maintain that same level of, we're not anticipating a war with a major power, are we now? Because we know it'll just descend into nuclear warfare. So we don't do it.
I think you're right.
Like,
You're saying
you've got health issues and stuff as well that it feeds into, and it would aid.
you're saying why now? Why now? What suddenly different that we should have national service now? I do think that it comes back to what Ben and I have been saying. We do sound a bit, oh yeah, it's all going to be great and sunny and rosy, but
Sunlit uplands.
It is about social cohesion, and I do think that we are a society that has been shown to be very fractured. We are a society that people do feel left behind. And I think that the way you do that is to get engagement with the state. It's like we're talking about policing. If you had people going into the police for a year, it would change people's relationship with the police. It would change different groups' relationships with the police. You would feel the police are us. They are there for us.
But on the different side of that coin is the way to bring society together, to take millions of people and make them do something they don't want to do.
Exactly.
But they only don't want to do it for the first generation.
For the first generation, which is 10,
well, I
15
think if
years.
you look at like Sweden, for example, Sweden got rid of national service
Voted to
after
bring it
100
back, aren't
years,
they?
voted to bring it back 10 months later.
In Switzerland, they voted for it
Yeah.
3 times in referendums.
3 times the Swiss have brought national service
But
back.
again, like, these are countries that they don't do anything with their army, do they? Really? Like, what does Switzerland do?
And also,
what does Sweden do?
And also, they've had it for such a long time, so it is part of the culture. I think the pro points you're arguing for, I agree with, but I think it's very, very difficult to get to that outcome. If you get an outcome where everyone does it and everyone just that's the norm, then I think it's great. But to get there is a lot. It's definitely not certain that you will ever get there.
Well, I think
exactly. Like, Sweden voted to bring it back because I think they'd had it for so long that it was part of the culture. But for here, it isn't. And I think that if you implement it and then say 10 years later had a vote like they have, it would probably get rescinded again. Is what I think.
Okay, so we've all discussed these points in quite a bit of detail. So what do we agree on? I think we can all certainly, for the first point, agree that any national service scheme couldn't possibly be restricted exclusively to the military.
Yeah.
I think another key point is that there needs to be really strong incentives. You can't just force this many people into something they don't want to do and not offer them, even if it's something like a tax break over the next few years or a massive discount on a student loan. You need to offer them, you need to massively emphasize the things that they will gain from this, and then also offer these massive incentives to really get people on board initially.
Yeah, probably incentives, and definitely I think there should be, from like a moral standpoint, you shouldn't force any of these national service kind of people who are participants. You shouldn't force them into frontline combat roles, because you should never force somebody to take their life when they like don't give their kind of consent to do that.
I think another thing that would be massive is that I think this needs to be implemented, and that you need massive education about societal norms from a young age. I think everyone had PSHE in like high school, but I don't know about everyone else. For me, it was a complete joke and no one cared.
Yeah.
I think what you could do is implement this and make it a serious subject, and then perhaps say, okay, you can choose the modules. You can choose the modules you do, so you can go and do policing, you can go and do armed forces, you can go and do nursing. And if you do well in those modules, then you'll have a better chance of getting into the part of the program that you want to get into. So you decide, oh, okay, I want to go into policing. You take the policing modules within the citizenship course. You do really well, and you get fast-tracked onto the policing part of the program. And I think this could, if you make this a really strong vocational part of education, and especially you could take this to a lot of the lower skilled or lower performing students in school. One of the biggest problems is that they kind of go to school and they think, why do I need to study maths? I'm not going to do this. If you can say, look, here's this lesson, you work really hard and you can get fast-tracked into this career in policing through the NCS, or you can get fast-tracked into this career in the armed forces through the NCS, then you can potentially foster engagement and actually create a system where people understand the benefits and want to be part of it. So I think it needs to be integrated in a lot of different levels in order to get it to work.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think that just basically comes onto a wider discussion about the fact that we really do need to emphasize the benefits of vocational education in this country anyway. Yeah. And I think a national scheme where, okay, for the first few years, you kind of do have to do it. So like, say in school, you have to take these courses and then go and perform a service. And then after that, you can do whatever you want. I do think that would really have that kind of benefit of the people who don't want to do academic subjects after they leave. These people who do want to do academic subjects, that option is still there. It's like it is now, but the vocational aspect is greatly improved.
I think so too. I think that you should just make it like in school, maths, English, citizenship. Like at the moment, people don't know about how our society functions. I only learned about how local councils work only a few years ago. I didn't know how the court system works until I did jury service.
And you could even include things like paying taxes. How often do you see people be like, I never got taught how to pay taxes or how any of that works at school?
Home economics.
Yeah,
bring it back.
You can bring stuff like that.
You could teach people how to cook nutritious meals.
Yeah.
All that sort of stuff. Home budgeting.
Absolutely. You teach people how to engage with society in their lives. And I think you make that an aspect of it. And then if you did that in schooling from a young age, national service would really just be the logical conclusion of their education.
I listened to a really interesting podcast the other day, and it was with an Indian economist who he was chief economist at the IMF for a while, and he was the governor of the Bank of India.
Yeah, I listened to it.
He wrote a book called The Third Chapter, I believe. And basically what he said was, we've got the state and we've got the economy and markets. But the third chapter that's been missing, the third pillar of society that's been missing is society and community. That really needs to be emphasized more and really needs to be built more. There's a lot of the economies of all the major countries have been massively stimulated, and governments are very strong and stable now in most big nations. But there's part of the reason that we're perhaps seeing a decline in some of the democratic ideals that we've seen over the past 70 years and a rise in populism is that the community's been left behind. And what we need more is more large-scale programs to bring back a more feeling of community in society.
Green New Deal. Green New Deal.
Well, that's one of the
Green
things I
New
love.
Deal.
one of the
Green
things I
New
love
Deal is fuckholds and beta males.
And that's one of the things I love about university is the fact that I've got to meet all of you guys, and I think that that's what this podcast is. You know, it's 5 people from very different backgrounds who've met at university who wouldn't normally meet in their everyday lives if they didn't go and engage in the institution away from where they live. And I think that the national service has the propensity to be that, to bring people together from across society. And I think that that's what you'd have to strive to make it. But I think we've spoken a lot about the pros and the cons of national service, and I think we all recognise that there are changes in society that need to be made, and whether or not this is the solution to that, we don't know. But I think that it could be. I think if done right, I think we all agree that there are great things that could come out of national service, although it'd be very difficult to do. Brilliant. Oh, well, thank you, listeners, for listening to this first episode of Not Worth Saying. The rebranded Not Worth Saying. You're no longer alcoholics. We'll come up with a new catchy name. Okay, well, thank you, and we hope you listen to us again soon.
Good night. God bless.
Bye.